Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History By podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Mark Goodacre. And today we're discussing Mark's contribution to the book titled The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus. His contribution is called Missing Pieces. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and the pinned comment. And Mark Goodacre's YouTube channel will also be tagged in the description below, so you can go over there and subscribe to it if you haven't done so already. And that being said, Mark, thank you for joining me today.
It's always a pleasure, Jacob.
Thank you for joining me. Let me start with this. Can you recap a little bit on what is the next quest for the historical Jesus about? What is the book about in relation to that?
Yeah, thanks. It's really the brainchild of James Crossley and Christopher Keith, who are the editors of the piece, and they actually organised a conference, got a bunch of people together 2 or 3 years ago, thinking it was about 2022. And in Bedford, in Cambridgeshire, in England. And in a sense, it was a bit of a brainstorming exercise with scholars of the historical Jesus and of the New Testament to say, what's next for historical Jesus research? And every contributor begins their chapter by saying the next quest of the historical Jesus ... And in my case, it was, the next quest of the historical Jesus should consider the missing pieces. So really it's their brainchild, and the book then brings in more people than were at that conference. But it's a really interesting way of just thinking again, rebooting the whole enterprise. Every now and then historical Jesus research just needs a big kick up the pants. It needs to be, that's not saying Jesus kick up the pants, but the quest itself, it needs a kick, just to sort of say, what are we doing here? What are we doing here?
Right.
Have we thought through some basic questions?
What are the missing pieces that you want the next quest for the historical Jesus to consider?
Well, the difficulty, as I see it, is that a lot of historical Jesus scholars behave as if all the really, really important data is available somewhere. In other words, we have got in the records somewhere all the data we really need to get a good general portrait of the historical Jesus together. And my problem with that is that people simply don't reflect on the fact that the vast majority of the pieces are missing. In other words, we've got the tiniest slither of material available about the historical Jesus. Even if you think that every single thing that you find in the 4 canonical Gospels, and let's throw in the Gospel of Thomas as well, and the Gospel of Peter, or whatever you want to throw in, even if all of that is 100% historical, which it's not, but even if it were, that's only a tiny slither of Jesus's life. So that's really what I want to do, is just get people to reflect on the bits that we don't have.
What were the points that Rudolph Bulman tried to make?
Well, he's famous for this saying that I do indeed think that we can know almost nothing about the life and personality of Jesus. And he kind of scandalized people by saying that. But what he was really trying to say is that there isn't any kind of biographical narrative of the development of Jesus's personality in the Gospels. I think the key bit in that quotation is the word personality. So you can't trace Jesus's psychological development when you look at the Synoptic Gospels or John. What you're looking at is later memories, later reflections on the character of Jesus. So Bulman was trying to remind people that we don't have the right kind of data for a comprehensive picture of the historical Jesus. And that's one of the reasons I kind of begin with looking back at that statement by Bulman.
What is the problem of the selective nature in the Gospels?
Well, one of the things that I think is seldom pointed out is that the Gospels themselves draw attention to how selective they're being. I mean, so this isn't like me doing some kind of radical thing pointing out that we haven't got lots of material about Jesus. The Gospel writers themselves tell us how selective they're being. So, for example, in Luke's Gospel, Luke always says things like, and it came to pass that, it happened that. It's like almost like one day this happened, which means that you're getting the impression when you're reading Luke's Gospel that you're just seeing little vignettes, little bits and pieces from Jesus's life implying that there's loads of others that he could have chosen, but he didn't. So he's being self-consciously selective. Or you look in Mark's gospel, and Mark will say, and Jesus was teaching the crowd, and in his teachings he said. So in other words, there's loads more teachings that he doesn't give us. And then perhaps the most famous example of this is the end of John's gospel, where the author basically says, look, we could write about loads more. We could do loads more. In fact, I think if all the things that Jesus did were written down, the whole world wouldn't fill the books. Well, the point is we haven't got the whole world full of books. We've just got this selection. And at the end of John 20, he says, well, we've chosen a bunch of signs, and these ones that we've chosen are so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And by saying that, he's saying there's loads and loads of other stuff I could have chosen, but I've chosen just this stuff. So this principle of selectivity is right there in all four canonical Gospels. And for what it's worth, you get it in other early Christian texts as well. The Gospel of Thomas constantly gives the impression that what you've got is a bunch of Jesus's sayings drawn almost as if they're kind of at random. It's just, and Jesus said, and Jesus said. It doesn't say, then he said this, and then he said that. He just pulls them out as if, they're selected from the one as the ones that the author of the Gospel of Thomas really wants to focus in on.
So what do you mean by more Jesus than history?
I suppose it's that when we look at the Gospels, we do find out what the gospel writers want to tell us about Jesus. But what we do is we extrapolate so quickly a lot of the time to the historical Jesus. And what I'm saying is we need to think a bit more seriously about what it means to do ancient history. So there's a thing that a lot of historians don't reflect on enough, and that's that in the modern world, we've got too many sources to do history well. We've just got a proliferation of sources. So, like, if I wanted to write a biography of an American president or a British prime minister from the 20th and 21st century, there's so much material that the historian's problem is what to sift through. The ancient historian's problem is basically almost the exact opposite, because we just don't have the relevant materials. We've got tiny sketches. So to take the obvious example, where are the stories about Jesus' childhood? It's just one in Luke's gospel, and then a bunch of legendary ones in the infancy gospel of Thomas too. And Luke's one, it might be legendary as well. Lots of scholars think that it is. You then have nothing until Jesus is 30, according to Luke. So right there, that's the majority of Jesus' life missing until they decide to focus in on that latter part of his life. So that's really what I'm talking about, is that when we're doing ancient history, we have to reflect seriously on what we don't know and be conscious of that we don't know a lot of stuff.
Can you tell us about the ethical issues that distort the data and conclusions made into the quest?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to write this piece is that missing pieces in the historical Jesus quest, it's not just a kind of fun puzzle, because missing pieces are also missing people. And the people who are missing from the story are frequently those that we would really love to hear more about: enslaved people, children, many female characters that don't have names. It's always frustrating that far more of the men in the narrative are named than the women, and frequently there are women who are clearly just don't appear on the pages of the New Testament. So that's what I mean about it being an ethical issue as well, because when we reflect on these missing pieces, we reflect on the people who are missing in the narrative. And that, I think, helps us to, if you like, make the ancient materials highly relevant. It's harder to make them highly relevant to the contemporary situation if we don't reflect on those key ethical concerns. So that's one of the issues. I suppose one of the other things that is important to me is that if we don't reflect meaningfully on the missing pieces, then we allow other people to fill in those gaps, including people that create forgeries or that do or that make bizarre claims. It's like it's important for us to be able to say to ourselves lots of the time, we will not ever know the answer to some of these key questions. Did Jesus have a wife is probably the most obvious one. We just don't know. And then, when a papyrus fragment turns up that's called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, everyone goes, oh, wow, so maybe Jesus had a wife then. And what happens is it's like the forgers and the sensationalists pour material into the gaps in the record. And that's why we need to reflect on the gaps in the record. It becomes an important ethical issue.
Yeah, and I remember that you also talked about not just with forged texts, but archaeological data as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because one of the issues that you do have when it comes to the archaeology is that we're desperate, and I'm speaking of myself here, but we're desperate to have archaeological data about Jesus and about his surroundings that we just don't have. And that then makes us aspire to have stuff that's not actually there. So when the James ossuary was discovered, for example, is that the ossuary, the bone box of Jesus's brother James? And my answer to that is it probably isn't. And one of the reasons why we want it to be so much is because we are missing so much of that key data. So we don't reflect on that missing data. So it's back to that point again. It's like we overreach when we're making our archaeological claims. And one of the things that's disappointing about that is that there is so much good, interesting archaeology that's relevant to the Jesus quest. And that's the stuff we should be focusing on, and not the kind of sensationalist stuff or the bigger sensationalist claims.
And I know that there's actually some attempts right now to try to validate the James ossuary and the patina and the writing style on it. And even if it did turn out somehow, if it is really James, okay, we have his ossuary, great. We still don't know. It doesn't tell us anything more about his life. Okay, he's in there, great.
No, it really wouldn't tell us a great deal. What it would do, if we could find some incontrovertible proof that it was the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus, it would then validate certain things that are said in the New Testament, which like name Jesus's brother as being James. Mark 6:3 has James, the brother of Jesus. He's also called the Lord's brother in Galatians. So it would validate that, but not much more than that. And for what it's worth, I don't think that the patina helps us at all with the James ossuary, because one of the reasons that Oded Golan in his trial was acquitted, at least one of the key pieces of evidence, was a photograph that he produced of the James ossuary at his home from the 1970s. And if it was in Oded Golan's apartment in the 1970s, then the patina stuff is irrelevant, because the tomb wasn't even, I mean, if it was the Talpiot tomb, that wasn't even excavated until the early 1980s. So I think it doesn't help us particularly. Unfortunately, I wish it did, but I don't think it does.
That's interesting, because that makes me wonder if that would also contradict the idea that some make, because some try to claim that the James ossuary was the missing ossuary from the tomb.
Yeah, that to me is the real problem, because if it is the missing ossuary, how did Oded Golan have it in his apartment before the tomb was excavated? It just doesn't work. Or that photograph isn't genuine, and then there's another problem, because that's the main evidence that the James ossuary
vindicated him.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one problem after the other, no matter which direction you go.
It does. And quite often scholarships like that, you get this pull this way, and then there's something else is pulling you the other way. And in some senses, it's why you have to always look at as much of the data as you can and not just be selective.
One last thing I'd like to ask you is, when you look at how the Gospels relate to each other, you point out that there are hints in the Gospels, very clear hints, that they are being selective in what they are talking about. Mm-hmm. But they're also using each other too as sources. Like Luke using Matthew and Mark, and they're both using Mark, and John using them. So how does one tell when they are getting it from the other, and when it's coming from a missing source? And when it's coming from a missing source, like Matthew, Luke, and John have things that aren't in the previous ones. Matthew, Luke have things that are in Mark. John has things that aren't in them. How does one tell when they're being creative and when they're borrowing from a lost source? How does that methodologically work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and a lot of people will know that I tend to be on the more skeptical side when it comes to missing sources, lost sources, hypothetical layers, hypothetical communities, and things like that. I suppose one thing that I always want to say about that in a general way is that I'm not skeptical that there were more sources around. It's not that there weren't more actual physical sources. It's that we don't have the ability to reconstruct them on the basis of what we've got. So I'm sure that in John's Gospel, for example, there's some data that John has pulled on from outside of the Synoptics, because he refers to place names that we know existed, right? I mean, whether whatever the history of what he's doing, he's got some information from somewhere. But whether we can reconstruct that as scholars, that's the difficulty. So for me, to answer your great question about the sort of methodology, my methodology is begin with what we have. Start with what we've got. Start with the physical works or the witnesses to the physical works, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, Thomas, etc., and ask if you can make sense of them on the basis of what we have. And I think that in all of those cases, you can actually make great sense of the Gospels. Matthew is using Mark, Luke is using Matthew and Mark, John is using all three, Thomas using all three, Peter using them. I think that actually is a more promising way forward. But then you do have to keep reminding yourself, there must have been other stuff. There must have been other stuff. It's just that I don't think we can dig it out of the text we have. I often feel that New Testament scholars are like frustrated archaeologists. They desperately like the idea that they can dig down into the text and recover lost artifacts. But unfortunately, literary study isn't the same as archaeology. It's at best a good metaphor for it. It's not the same thing.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick that Mark Goodacre's YouTube channel is tagged in the description below, and the link to purchase the book is also in the description below as well. That being said, Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Always a pleasure, Jacob. Thanks very much.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.